There comes a moment in every manipulative relationship when the balance begins to shift. At first, they seem untouchable. They dictate your emotions, your reactions, even your sense of self. You spend countless nights wondering how to make them understand you, hoping they will finally change. But something unexpected happens. You stop chasing. You stop explaining. You begin to see through the illusion. And when that happens, the narcissist notices long before you do. The strange part is that they rarely admit they are losing control. Instead, their behavior changes in subtle yet powerful ways. What once looked like confidence begins to crack. Their certainty turns into desperation. Their manipulation becomes more obvious because it no longer works as effortlessly as before. The greatest victory is not making a narcissist suffer. It is becoming someone they can no longer manipulate. Today, we will explore two powerful signs that reveal a narcissist is losing control over you, and more importantly, how you can continue walking toward freedom without being pulled back into their emotional traps. The greatest mistake people make is believing that power always looks loud. They imagine control as shouting, threats, or obvious intimidation, but true manipulation is often quiet. It is woven into daily conversations, hidden inside guilt, disguised as love, and wrapped in promises that are never meant to be fulfilled. A narcissist does not need to raise their voice every day if they can make you question your own reality. That is their greatest advantage. As long as you doubt yourself, they never have to doubt themselves. For months, sometimes years, they study your emotional patterns. They learn what hurts you. They learn what makes you apologize. They learn what makes you stay. Every argument becomes research. Every tear becomes information. Every moment you explain yourself teaches them exactly how to keep you emotionally attached. This is why manipulation becomes so effective over time. It is customized. It is personal. It is built around your deepest emotional needs. Perhaps you long to feel understood, so they promise understanding. Perhaps you fear abandonment, so they threaten to leave. Perhaps you value loyalty, so they accuse you of betrayal. Whatever matters most to you eventually becomes the very thing they use against you. But something remarkable begins to happen when healing enters your life. It rarely begins with one dramatic decision. Instead, it starts quietly. You pause before reacting. You stop answering every accusation. You no longer rush to defend your character. You begin recognizing that not every criticism deserves a response. For the first time, you ask yourself a simple question. What if I don't have to prove my innocence to someone committed to misunderstanding me? That single question changes everything. Because manipulation survives on emotional participation. Without your emotional investment, the cycle begins to collapse. At first, the narcissist may not notice. They assume this is temporary. They believe you are simply tired. But then your consistency grows. Your silence becomes intentional. Your confidence becomes visible. You stop seeking permission to trust your own experiences. That is the exact moment the narcissist begins to panic. Not because they suddenly love you more, but because they are losing access to the emotional control they once enjoyed. Notice how their behavior suddenly becomes inconsistent. One day they shower you with affection. The next day they ignore you completely. One morning they promise a beautiful future together. By evening they accuse you of ruining everything. One week they describe you as the greatest person they have ever met. The following week they speak as though you have become their greatest disappointment. This emotional instability is not random. It serves a purpose. Confused people are easier to influence. Exhausted people stop questioning. Emotionally overwhelmed people often return to familiar patterns simply because they want the conflict to end. The narcissist understands this instinctively. When calm manipulation stops producing results, emotional chaos becomes the next strategy. You may notice them creating problems where none exist. A peaceful evening suddenly becomes an argument. A simple conversation becomes an interrogation. A misunderstanding becomes proof that you never cared. Why? Because peace strengthens your clarity. Chaos weakens it. The more peaceful you become, the more clearly you recognize unhealthy behavior. The narcissist cannot afford that clarity, so they introduce confusion. Then something even stranger begins. The person who ignored your feelings suddenly becomes obsessed with them. They ask endless questions. Why are you happier lately? Who have you been talking to? Why don't you call as often? Why aren't you upset anymore? Why do you seem so confident? These questions may sound caring, but look deeper. Someone who spent years dismissing your emotions rarely becomes emotionally aware overnight. More often, they are trying to measure whether they still have influence over your inner world, because your emotional independence is something they cannot control. The healthiest version of you becomes unpredictable to someone who depended on your predictability. Another common behavior appears. Love bombing returns. Suddenly they remember anniversaries. They buy thoughtful gifts. They send emotional messages. They speak about soulmates. They promise counseling. They promise marriage. They promise honesty. They promise a completely different future. Everything sounds exactly like what you hoped to hear months or even years ago. The timing is important. Ask yourself this question. If they truly understood your pain, why did compassion only appear when they realized they were losing control? Real transformation begins with responsibility, not panic. Healthy people apologize because they recognize the pain they caused. Manipulative people often apologize because they fear losing access to the person they were controlling. These two motivations may sound similar, but they create completely different futures. One builds trust. The other rebuilds dependency. You may also notice guilt becoming stronger than ever. They remind you of everything they have done for you. They talk about sacrifices. They mention memories. They tell you that no one else will ever love you the same way. They insist that leaving means abandoning them during their hardest season. Listen carefully. Love never demands that you destroy yourself to prove your loyalty. Healthy love invites growth. Manipulation demands self-sacrifice without mutual respect. When guilt stops working, fear often replaces it. They may warn that your future will be miserable. They predict failure. They suggest you will regret leaving. Sometimes they even claim your friends are turning against you. All of these tactics share one purpose: to make independence appear more frightening than staying. But healing changes the equation. You begin realizing something powerful. Fear loses its authority once truth becomes stronger than illusion. Another subtle sign emerges. The narcissist begins reacting emotionally to your peace. Think about that for a moment. Not your anger, not your sadness, your peace. Your silence begins bothering them more than your arguments ever did. Why? Because arguments still gave them access to your emotions. Silence tells them the emotional door is beginning to close. This is why many people experience an increase in manipulation immediately before freedom. The closer you move toward emotional independence, the harder someone invested in controlling you may try to pull you back. Do not mistake this increased effort for increased love. Intensity is not intimacy. Persistence is not respect. Desperation is not transformation. Remember that. Real love feels safe. Real love welcomes honesty. Real love respects boundaries. Real love celebrates your confidence instead of fearing it. Perhaps the greatest shift of all happens inside you. You no longer wake up wondering how to avoid upsetting them. Instead, you wake up asking how to protect your own peace. You no longer organize your life around their moods. You organize it around your values. You no longer believe every accusation. You trust your own experience. You no longer confuse emotional drama with emotional depth. You understand that calm relationships are not boring. They are healthy. This quiet confidence becomes impossible for the narcissist to control, because confidence cannot be manipulated through guilt. Awareness cannot be erased through gaslighting. Self-respect cannot be negotiated away. The more you heal, the less predictable you become to someone who relied on your emotional reactions, and that is why they grow more desperate. Not because you became cruel, not because you became distant, but because you finally became free. Always remember this truth. The loudest emotional storms often appear just before manipulation loses its power forever. Do not let temporary chaos convince you that you are moving in the wrong direction. Sometimes the greatest evidence that you are healing is not that life becomes quieter immediately. It is that the people who once controlled you become increasingly uncomfortable with the peace you have found. And that discomfort is not your responsibility. Your responsibility is to continue choosing truth over illusion, peace over chaos, self-respect over approval, and freedom over fear. One of the greatest sources of power a narcissist possesses is not physical strength, intelligence, or even confidence. It is predictability. For a long time, they know exactly how to move you emotionally. They know which words will make you defend yourself. They know which accusations will make you cry. They know which silent treatments will leave you anxious. They know exactly how long to disappear before you begin questioning your own worth. To them, your reactions become a map. Every time you explain yourself, they learn another weakness. Every time you chase after them, they become more certain they still have control. Every time you forgive without accountability, they believe there will never be real consequences for their behavior. Over time, this creates an invisible prison, not one built with walls, but one built with habits. You begin reacting automatically. You apologize before understanding what happened. You overthink every conversation. You replay arguments in your mind, searching for mistakes that were never yours. You become so focused on keeping the peace that you slowly lose your own. That is exactly what emotional control looks like. It is not always obvious. It does not always involve screaming. Sometimes it simply means someone else has become the author of your emotional life. But healing changes everything. Healing does not begin when they change. Healing begins when you do. It begins the moment you stop asking, "How do I make them understand me?" and instead ask, "Why am I exhausting myself trying to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding me?" That question is the beginning of freedom. As your healing grows, something remarkable starts happening. The old emotional buttons stop working. They criticize you. Instead of arguing, you smile politely. They accuse you. Instead of defending yourself, you simply state the truth once and move on. They try to provoke jealousy. Instead of chasing, you continue living your life. At first, this confuses them. They expect the familiar version of you, the version that apologized too quickly, the version that cried after every insult, the version that constantly searched for their approval, but that person is slowly disappearing. And that is deeply unsettling for someone who depended on your predictability. Imagine a chess player who has memorized every move of their opponent. For years, they have won because every game follows the same pattern. Then one day, their opponent begins making completely different moves. Suddenly, every strategy fails. Every prediction becomes wrong. Every manipulation loses its target. This is exactly what happens when emotional awareness replaces emotional reactivity. The narcissist realizes something they never expected. They can no longer control the outcome. That uncertainty feels terrifying to them because control creates security. Without control, they experience the very instability they spent years creating inside someone else. Notice how their tactics begin changing. They may suddenly become unusually kind, not because kindness has transformed their heart, but because anger no longer produces the desired result. When kindness fails, they may return to criticism. When criticism fails, they may become the victim. When victimhood fails, they may disappear completely. Then, months later, sometimes even years later, they return as though nothing ever happened. This pattern is often called hoovering. Its purpose is simple: to test whether the emotional door is still open. They may send an innocent message, "I was just thinking about you," or "I hope you're doing well," or perhaps, "I've changed." Sometimes they create emergencies. Sometimes they invent reasons to reconnect. Sometimes they use mutual friends. Sometimes they mention old memories that once made your heart feel safe. Understand what is happening beneath the surface. They are not always trying to rebuild love. Often they are trying to rebuild access. Access to your emotions, access to your attention, access to your time, access to the emotional energy that once sustained their sense of importance. But your healing has changed something fundamental. You no longer confuse attention with affection. You no longer mistake intensity for intimacy. You no longer believe that someone missing you automatically means they value you. You begin looking beyond words. You begin watching actions. Consistency becomes more important than promises. Responsibility becomes more important than apologies. Respect becomes more important than chemistry. This new perspective makes manipulation incredibly difficult. Another noticeable change begins appearing. The narcissist starts escalating their behavior. If guilt does not work, they try fear. If fear does not work, they try pity. If pity fails, they may attempt to damage your reputation. Perhaps they speak negatively about you to family members. Perhaps they tell mutual friends that you abandoned them. Perhaps they portray themselves as the misunderstood victim. This can be painful, especially if you value honesty. Your instinct may be to defend yourself, to explain every detail, to correct every lie. But healing teaches an important lesson. Not every false story deserves your participation. People determined to misunderstand you rarely change because of another explanation. Peace sometimes requires allowing your character to speak louder than your arguments. Remember this, your reputation lives in other people's minds. Your character lives in your actions. Protect your character. Time often protects your reputation. One of the most beautiful signs of emotional freedom appears quietly. You stop measuring your worth through someone else's opinion. Think about how powerful that is. For years, one compliment could make your day. One criticism could destroy your confidence. Now, neither defines you. You appreciate kindness. You learn from healthy feedback. But your identity no longer belongs to someone else's approval. That is true emotional independence. The narcissist notices this immediately because they can no longer use validation as a reward or rejection as a punishment. Those tools have lost their power. And when manipulation loses its power, control begins to disappear. Many people fear becoming emotionally detached. They worry that setting boundaries means becoming cold. But healthy boundaries do not remove compassion. They remove exploitation. You can still care deeply. You can still forgive. You can still wish someone healing without giving them unlimited access to your peace. That is emotional maturity. One of the greatest transformations happens inside your own mind. You stop asking, how can I avoid upsetting them? Instead, you ask, does this decision honor my values? Notice the difference. The first question is driven by fear. The second is guided by self-respect. Fear keeps you trapped. Self-respect sets you free. As your confidence grows, another change becomes visible. Silence no longer feels uncomfortable. You no longer rush to fill every pause. You no longer explain every decision. You no longer need everyone to understand your choices. That silence is not weakness. It is strength under control. People who know who they are rarely feel the need to prove it. Eventually, the narcissist realizes something they never imagined. The person they once controlled no longer exists. The version of you who tolerated disrespect is gone. The version of you who begged for validation is gone. The version of you who confused emotional chaos with love is gone. Standing before them is someone different, someone who has learned that peace is more valuable than being right, someone who values boundaries more than temporary approval, someone who understands that self-respect is not selfish, it is necessary. And perhaps the most powerful realization of all is this: winning was never about making the narcissist suffer. Winning was never about getting revenge. Winning was never about proving them wrong. The real victory is waking up one morning and realizing they no longer control your thoughts. You no longer rehearse conversations that will never happen. You no longer wait for an apology that may never come. You no longer carry the burden of fixing someone who refuses to take responsibility. Instead, you carry something far more valuable: your peace, your clarity, your confidence, your future. Because freedom is not the moment they stop trying to control you. Freedom is the moment their attempts no longer work. And once you reach that place, you discover something extraordinary. The strongest person is not the one who wins every argument. The strongest person is the one who no longer needs to fight for the right to be respected. Walk forward with quiet confidence. Protect your boundaries without guilt. Choose peace over emotional chaos. Trust actions more than promises. And remember this truth every single day: the moment a narcissist can no longer predict your reactions is the moment they begin losing the very power they believe they would always have over you. That is not only their greatest fear, it is the beginning of your greatest freedom.